So let's just use that. So I'm posting it on all the groups so as to give people the opportunity to use those links. Okay, so we're welcome. We've already used 5 minutes of our time. So let's just proceed. We're welcome to the Ocular Deep Dive Point of Care series, specifically on ocular ultrasonography. So it's called Deep Dive because we will be spending time and we will be talking extra detail on certain topics that are, what's it called? That we will be encounter or certain areas of ultrasounds rather that will be encountered in your daily practice. But this won't just be a surface discussion. We'll be talking on the foundations and the key concepts that allow you competently practice the ultrasonography of such areas to be able to identify the common conditions associated with them that you will find in point of care. And so that's what we're going to be doing. That's what we're going to be doing. And so in this deep dive series, we're going to be talking on ocular ultrasonography. It's in 4 parts. That's why we're doing it for 4 days. We'll be talking about ocular anatomy in depth today, including the sonographic anatomy and the normal anatomy that allows you scan properly or appreciate the structures you see on the scan. Then tomorrow we'll be talking about the procedure and I'll be showing you how the procedure is done. The next tomorrow we'll be talking, and the day after I'll be talking about certain pathologies. We'll be talking about certain pathologies. So today we will be discussing about in-depthly on ocular scan, and I'll be simplifying it for us. Rather, we're discussing about ocular anatomy, and I'll be simplifying it for us so that we can appreciate that in what's it called, we can correlate it with what we see on the ultrasound scan, and with this would help us make assessments, proper assessments whenever needed. So under today's discussion we're going to be talking ocular anatomy. We're talking what's it called, we're talking normal sonographic anatomy of the eye. They'll also mention a little bit about the ultrasound, standard ultrasound measurements. Then we'll also talk about relevant ocular scan modes, and we'll talk about some of these ocular scan transducers. Is that okay? Please encourage your people who really need this topic, which is part of our and turn on the notification button. So for us to understand the ocular anatomy, which is the anatomy of the eye, we need to understand where the eye is situated. We need to understand where the eye is situated. And both eyes are situated in the human skull, as we see, which forms the bony framework of our digestive systems. So that is the place where you will be finding the scanning. And in understanding the anatomy, like I said, it's very important we start talking from a broader perspective and narrow it down to our major region of interest. So this human skull that you see, which protects the brain, sensory organs, upper part of the respiratory system, and digestive system, that is illustrated here, contains 22 bones. 22, just 22 bones. And we divide these bones into the cranial bones, the bones of the cranium, which is like the skull cap, and the facial bones. These bones support the facial structures and how some of these sensory organs, like the sight, the smell, and the taste. Is that okay? They are mentioned in these areas here. So these are the kind of bones that constitute the human skull. The bones that protect the brain and the one that supports the face and houses organs of sight, smell, and taste. All of this make up the 22 bones. Some appeared, some are not. Okay, so we can see it here, all of these bones shown in this diagram, from the parietal bone on the lateral view to the sphenoid to the frontal zygomatic bone, the maxilla, the nasal bone, the acromial bone, the occipital bone, temporal bone. I think I mentioned mandible, canthus, ethmoid bone, and all of this, the zygomatic bone, okay, and all of this make up the skull, as you can see. So, if we narrow it down further, this human skull is a highly complex bony architecture, and it is marked by, as you can see, numerous ridges, and all of this contribute to both form and function. The skull will not do anything for you if it is just a square without depressions and ridges and elevations and all of that. It's got some parts that are hollow. It's got some parts that are protruding. It's got different parts to it. Is that okay? And all of this contributes to the form and function. And take note of the words I used: ridges, prominences, depressions, and cavities. So on the anterior aspect, out of the many cavities, there are two symmetrical pyramidal cavities known as the orbits. So some of these cavities have names, and two of those cavities, paired and symmetrical, are called the orbits. And that's what we can see over here. And they are situated on either side of the nasal region, which is the supporting framework for the nose. Each orbit is a four-walled bony recess. That means it contains four walls. I didn't say it contains four bones. It contains four walls that opens anteriorly, as you can see here, and tapers like a cone posteriorly. So that gives it a pyramidal shape. And so therefore, if we're going to be trying to draw what the orbit looks like on the lateral view, it's going to be something like this, as you can see here, tapering at this end, and then anteriorly just opens up. Is that okay? So it serves as the protective housing for the eyeball, and it's associated neurovascular and soft tissue structures. So this is where the eyeball is situated in the orbit. So now, when we now talk on the bones that constitute the four walls of the orbit, how many are they? There are seven. And each and every one of them is mentioned here, and they are colorfully represented in this diagram by the side. So we have the frontal bone, and as you can see, that forms the superior wall over here, frontal bone. So you can see it forming like the roof. The zygomatic bone. Now, one of the things you should know about these bones, which well, I'll just still remind you about, is not only do they fully commit themselves to being part of the orbital structures, their parts also extend into all other regions to play certain roles, but they also contribute to the orbital structures. Not all of them, they don't just solely uh, uh, specialize in forming the orbit alone. They play roles in other parts too. So the zygomatic bone, which is like the cheek prominence, also forms part of the orbit lateral wall, as you can see. The maxillary bone, as you can see here, forms like the inferior wall, inferior medial wall here. Is that okay? and the sphenoid far back posteriorly, as you can see here in purple. Then the ethmoid bone medially, as you can see in green. Is that okay? And if you observe here, there is a part of it that is located in the nasal cavity, proving again that it does not just what's it called? Um, it doesn't just play a role in the formation of the orbit alone. It also plays some other functions, which we will not be talking about today. And then we can see the lacrimal bone in red, and we can see the palatine bone in yellow here. So all of this contribute to the orbit. All of this contribute to the orbit. So now, amongst the organs protected by the skull, specifically in the orbit, that cavity within the skull is that sensory organ that we call the eye. Yes, that's a key organ that is protected within the skull. It rests within the orbit along with other supporting structures like the extraocular muscles, orbital fat, nerves, and vessels, and together maintain position, protection, and coordinated functions, as we can see. Okay, I trust we are able to hear me and the network has been flowing freely so far, so good. You are, please, you can just let me know, okay? On the chat box, the live chat box. Is that okay? So, all right. Okay. So now that we have now talked about what houses the eye and we have now introduced the eye, let's now really talk about the nice ocular anatomy. So you can see the eye here, very beautiful structure. It's a nearly spherical organ sitting within the bony orbit. It has an average diameter of 24 millimeters and it is slightly smaller vertically than it is horizontally. So therefore, this is smaller than well, what's it called? Horizontally. So its main function is to focus light on the retina and transmit signals to the brain via the optic nerve. We all know that. That's basic anatomy. The eye will, what's it called? Receive light, take it to the retina converts it into electrical energy, and then that eventually is interpreted into vision. So the anatomy of the eye itself can now be described in two principal ways. Please know this. The first way we can do it is we can divide it, first of all, into two main segments, the anterior segment and the posterior segment. The reason we are doing this is to properly understand how the anatomical structures of the eye and how they coordinate and relate with one another. It's very, very key. We know this. So, sorry, I want to believe we can still hear me. I trust we can hear me. The anatomy of the eye itself can now be described into eyes ocular. So you can see the eye here. Sorry, please. I think there was a network issue there. So I just need to be sure that we can hear me now. Okay. So I believe I'm audible now. Okay. Just trying to make sure that I'm properly heard. Okay. That is what's horizontal. Okay. Okay. The anatomy of the eye. Okay, so I trust I'm audible now because there's been quite some network issues. Okay, I believe I'm audible now. Okay, just trying to make sure that I'm properly heard. All right, let's just move on. Let's just move on. Okay, please, if you can hear me, please let me know. Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you very much. All right. So the eye is functionally divided into two main segments: the anterior segment and the posterior segment. And what we do is we divide we just draw a simple line somewhere just close to the anterior part of the eye. And the reason we do that is because there is a strong relationship between okay, there's a strong relationship between the anterior segment and between the organs of the anterior segment. They are all responsible for light entry. All of them are responsible for light entry. Is that okay? And then refraction and maintaining intraocular pressure. The posterior segment is involved in photoreception, signal transduction, and optic nerve transmission, meaning that light comes in by virtue of what happens in the anterior segment. It receives it, while the posterior segment receives and converts the light into electrical energy or into action potential for transmission of within the nerves and interpretation. And then structurally, we actually also divide this eye into three concentric layers: the fibrous layer, the vascular layer, and the neural layer. So these are the three layers. So we're going to talk about it in detail. So the ocular, let's talk about the segmental division first. Well, and then we proceed to the other side. Let's talk about the segmental division. So as you can see here, this is a visible demonstration of the segmental division. And here we have the anterior segment and the posterior segment. The anterior segment here right now, the anterior segment divides in the anterior segment we have some structures. The ciliary body. First of all, let's start from anteriorly. We have the nice cornea here, we have the lens, we have the iris, and we have the ciliary body. Those are the things that form those are the things within the anterior segment. And then within the posterior segment, we have the retina, retina, the vitreous, as you can see, what we call the fovea, and then the optic nerve, the choroid, and the sclera. All of this, we'll talk about it. In the what's it called, in the structural classification, it is still all these structures that are within the eyeball when we look at it in that way. However, we are now going to be looking at it in concentric circles, which you will get when we are talking about the structural classification. So let's look at the anatomy of the things within the anterior segment first of all. The anterior segment is primarily responsible for light entry. It is responsible for refraction and maintaining intraocular pressure. So when we're talking of high intraocular pressure, what's it called? How light enters the eye. Leave it to the anterior. Leave it to the anterior segment. That's its function there. And we have talked about the components of the anterior segment. Like we said, it is responsible for light entry. Light enters the eye through the anterior segment. It is properly directed, refracted in the anterior segment. And the intraocular pressure is maintained by the parts or components of the anterior segment. What are the key components of the anterior segment? The first is the cornea. This thing is very important. And that is this transparent avascular outermost layer of the anterior segment. And much of the refraction of light, is that okay? That is bending of light happens, which is very, very important in the retina being able to catch the light, happens in the cornea. 70% of the eye's refractive capacity is in the cornea. And it consists of 5 layers. Take notes. The first is the epithelium. Is that okay? Then the second is this nice thin layer called the Bowman's layer. Then the next one is the stroma, the thick stroma. Then the next one is what we call the descent membrane, and the other one is called the endothelium, which is the last one. So the epithelium, Bowman's layer, stroma, descent membrane, and the endothelium. These are the components of the cornea on histology, and it is from outer to inner. So the epithelium is outer, the endothelium is inner. Just remember that. Epithelium outer, endothelium inner. For the anterior chamber, which is the next part, as you can see, the cornea forms the outer boundary of the anterior chamber, which is this space behind the cornea here. This nice space behind the cornea is the anterior chamber. So we open the door of the cornea, we create a hole in the cornea. The next thing we are seeing is a very nice dome-shaped space called the anterior chamber. And it is a fluid-filled space in between the cornea, as you can see here, the cornea here, and the nice iris, which is this donut-shaped individual here. It's filled with fluid, and the fluid here is called the aqueous humor, and it is produced by a particular portion joined to the iris called the ciliary body. And this fluid is what helps maintain intraocular pressure. We'll talk about it in more detail. This fluid is also important because it also nourishes all of those structures that don't have blood vessels by themselves. That's what it does. So the next structure is the posterior boundary of the anterior chamber, of the anterior chamber, or the posterior boundary of the anterior chamber, which is the iris. This iris, this iris is a pigmented muscular structure controlling pupil size to regulate light entry. Is that okay? So it looks like a donut. It has a hole in between, and that hole is the pupil, as you can see ably represented here. Is that okay? It regulates light entry. the anterior and it forms, what's it called, it forms the posterior boundary of the anterior chamber, basically regulates air entry, and it also forms what we call the anterior boundary of the posterior chamber. What is the anterior boundary of the posterior chamber? We'll get to know about that in some in a few. So let's remember again. We drilled a hole through the cornea. We met a dome-shaped space. We explored it. It was filled with fluid. Then the back of the dome-shaped space is the iris. The iris has a hole inside. That hole is called the pupil, and that pupil is the central aperture of the iris, and it adjusts in size like a sphincter. Is that okay? To control light passage. So we now pass through that pupil. What we will be seeing will be another small space again. And then after that small space is the lens, which is what we are seeing in white here. What is the name of the small space? That small space is what we know as the posterior chamber. So went through the pupil, and then we find this nice small space here. It's smaller than the anterior chamber space, but that is where the lens is that is a space whose posterior boundary is still going to be formed by the lens. This is very important because it helps, because you'll be seeing this on anatomy, and you will definitely need to know exactly what you're dealing with. So the posterior chamber is a narrow space between the iris and the lens. It's also filled with aqueous humor, and it's continuous with the anterior chamber via the pupil. Remember, we go through the anterior chamber, through the pupil, and we enter the posterior chamber. So there is a space. Now, this lens that forms the posterior boundary of the posterior chamber, is that okay? Is it just suspended? No, it's not. What happens is that, and we're going to talk about it, is it just suspended without anything holding it? No. At the attachment portion of the iris, you will see some finger-like projections that we can see here. These finger-like projections bring out some strings from them, and these strings hold the lens in position just behind the iris. And so the iris is in front, the lens is behind, suspended by these fibers, so which are called suspensory ligaments, arising from the ciliary body. It connects the ciliary body performs the function of connecting the iris to the choroid, as you can see. The choroid, we're going to talk about the choroid shortly. And then also too, it contains ciliary muscles which control lens shape for accommodation, and ciliary processes which produce aqueous humor. So what I have described are the fibers that arise from this ciliary body. But beyond that, on that same ciliary body, you will see it sweat out some fluid. That fluid is what enters through the posterior chamber, through the pupil, to fill in the anterior chamber. It fills in the anterior chamber. Is that okay? And then also through the influence of those suspensory fibers that holds the lens, when the ciliary bodies contract, which you will learn shortly, they will what's it called? Lead to stretching of the lens or contraction of the lens. This in itself influences how light appears on the retina. Let's move on from here. So we can see the lens itself is a biconvex transparent structure posterior to the iris, and it focuses light onto the retina via accommodation. It is suspended by zonular fibers. And those zonular fibers, like I explained, are fibrous strands that connect the ciliary body to the lens. So you can see them here. So they are connecting the ciliary body to the lens. So the anatomy is so simple. With all of that, we have discussed what is in the anterior chamber. Come through the cornea, drill a hole in the cornea, you will find a beautiful dome-shaped space called the anterior chamber. And after the anterior chamber, you will now see the iris. Within the iris, there is a central aperture called the pupil. Enter through the pupil you will almost be touching the lens. But in between that iris, the back of the iris and the lens, you will find a small space called the posterior chamber. So that small space, which is the posterior chamber, what's it called, is bounded posteriorly by the lens and anteriorly by the iris. The lens is not just seated there, suspended freely. It is held by ligaments that, what's it called? It's held by ligaments that arise from the ciliary body and hold it in place. So that's the way it goes. Sorry, my face is not clear right now because of what's it called, poor lighting. Okay. All right. So let's move on. Okay. So then now let's talk on the posterior segment very quickly. Let's run through the posterior segment. Now, I haven't spoken about the anterior segment. The posterior segment includes structures posterior to the lens. So everything from the lens backward is the posterior segment. So the lens literally forms the boundary between the anterior segment and the posterior segment. And there's a difference between anterior chamber and anterior segment. And there's a difference between posterior chamber and posterior segment. As you can see, both the anterior chamber and the posterior chamber are in the anterior segment. So the posterior segments include structures that are primarily for photoreception and signal transduction and optic nerve transmission. Signal transduction means we are converting those lights to action potential. Is that okay? And so what we have first is the vitreous humor. It is, and as you can see, it's been dissected here. That black, that transparent thing is a clear gel-like substance filling the vitreous chamber between the lens and the retina, maintaining the globe shape. It supports the retina and allows light transmission. Then the next one we have just behind the vitreous is the retina. This is and we're going to spend time on the retina. It is a multi-layered neurosensory tissue lining the posterior eye. It contains photoreceptors. We've been hearing of rods and cones. All that rods and cones is just, it's not in every area of the eye. It's just in the retina. There are cellular structures that are on a microscopic level that you'll be able to see on histology.